Okay, hi, my name is Jaime Stief. I work with the Tamarack Institute. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. I share this as an act of truth, knowing that it is a first step, but that reconciliation takes much more than that. We encourage everybody to share where they're joining us from in the uh, chat box, and we look forward to, as we have this conversation today, thinking about some of the connections between what we're discussing and the truth that the TRC calls to actions. We'd also like to give an African ancestral acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge those who came to Turtle Island as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to the lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Tamarack wishes to pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent and thank them for their contributions towards transforming systems in ways that promote everyone's sense of belonging and safety. And with that, I will hand the microphone over to Danya Pastuszek, who is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute.
Well, see, Jaime, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very grateful to be joining all of you here today. I want to start by saying that I'm standing in for my wonderful colleague, Myriam, who has been one of the architects of this conversation and really engaged with Louise and Jean-Noé and others who will talk about along with me over these last many months. Please send Myriam some healing vibes. She's not feeling well today, but want to honor her presence by mentioning that she was planning to be here. I am so happy to get to be here with my friends Jean-Noé Landry and Louise Adongo, who I've been talking with, as I mentioned, around this project for many months now. Many of you likely know Louise and Jean-Noé. They are leaders across borders, but I'll just offer a few words about what I appreciate with them before saying a bit about Tamarack's partnership with Transition Bridges Project, and then turning time over to them. And then, of course, turning time to all of you who have joined us, because we're really eager to hear your experiences with the questions and ideas that Jean-Noé and Louise and their team have been working on. And we're really eager to hear your questions as well. So Louise, as many of you know, is a bold and grounded leader. She has led organizations that catalyze systems change. She has worked in governments to build social policy labs and to bring policymakers together to work on different types of things that they might not have been able to in their silos. She is an amazing speaker, writer, and bridger on everything from social capital to Black excellence to reconciliation to systems change, both within and across systems. Jean-Noé is the lead of the Climate Data Studio, which fosters data collaboration for climate action. It's hosted by Next Generation Cities Institute at Concordia. He has also worn many hats and played many roles, though, present and past. He's worked on political campaigns and movement building, peace and conflict studies, and open technology. I learned so much from him about data. And really, every time I listen to or I read pieces or I spend time with Jean-Noé and Louise, I know that I'm around people who really believe in the power of collaboration, that I'm around people who really believe in the power of deep dialogue and who are committed to having deep dialogue to address the inequities that we persist in right now and to imagine and achieve the future that we know is possible. And I know that I'm around people who are really looking to build collaborative leadership structures to create the transformation that we also know is needed. So that's really why it's been such a pleasure to work with both of them, along with their colleagues, Lara Ivoy, Stéphane Guedouis, and Patrick Dubé over the last many months to think together about how we make progress on complex issues. As all of you know, our key role here at Tamarack is to help collaboratives at the local level to imagine what a future could look like and to work together to make progress toward that future. And so what Louise and Jean-Noé and their colleagues have been working on is a really important tool and framework and mindset for how to do that work. We're very happy to be in partnership with them. And with that, I will pass the time to them to tell you what they've been up to and to gain your wisdom on it. Louise and Jean-Noé, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Very, very much appreciative, and the opportunity to, well, tag team with my fellow co-steward Louise for this wonderful webinar that we have set up for us today. As you said, Danya, I mean, the emphasis today is really to kind of share with the group and participants, how we came about to think about systemic mediation, recognizing that it falls into a long line of a lot of thinking and a lot of doing and a lot of actions that have been taken around systems change. And I know that that's something that's at the heart of Tamarack's mission. We wanted to share with you a quick update about the different steps and stages that we've taken that brings us to today and opportunities that lie ahead. But before doing that, because we're talking about a bit of a newish concept around systemic mediation, we thought that it would be kind of interesting to share each of our journeys around how systemic mediation came to resonate with each of us differently, because we are different people that have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences, have had access to different opportunities and whatnot. And today we wanted to each kind of take a bit of time to share with you that, and then open it up for a conversation with you all, and really kind of listen and wanting to hear actively and listen actively how the systemic mediation connect or not with you. And finally, to wrap up, we wanted to also see, based on the conversation that we've had today, if there's any interest to kind of pursue kind of deeper conversations with some of you as a follow-up to this webinar today. So that would be kind of we want to finish with an invitation to you. Okay, systemic mediation. Okay, so I think the key here, and it's coming up with a definition is not an easy thing, just to kind of say it. And I think what we want to kind of underline here is that we recognize that systemic mediation, as I said, kind of situates itself into kind of a lot of different ways that people have been already thinking about systems change. But we also saw that there might be something a little bit missing that is already being embodied by a lot of systems change leaders, at different scales in communities across Canada and internationally. And so systemic mediation, our definition, it's a working definition. We know it's going to change. It's not perfect. We expect it to do so. It's an opportunity for dialogue. And so if we think of systemic mediation, just to kind of tee it up here, it is a practice of acting as an intermediary between different actors, scale systems to facilitate dialogue, as I said, to reach mutual understanding and resolve conflicts. So it's not easy. And that's part of the point, is that it's something that a lot of us are already doing, but we're not necessarily kind of naming the competencies and the skills and the tools that we rely on already, or that we could kind of help each other out in becoming kind of better systemic mediators. So it supports interventions carried out at various levels individually. So that inner work that is so kind of critical and fundamental to being a systems change leader, organizationally and systemically, and also culturally and metaphysically. And I think the metaphysical piece is also one that I think we all hold very, in our hearts, because it's kind of the way that it shapes our worldviews. And if we're about being able to step up and collaborate kind of actively and effectively together across sectors, across organizations, it needs to come from within in many ways. And so as mediators, we can help identify common interests, encourage collaboration, and negotiate agreements that can contribute to the development of resilience and regenerative communities. So that's our kind of a proposal in a way, and for the next slide here, we'll give you an update on how we've kind of come about with to the point where we are today. At first, it was really about kind of embodying a practice without necessarily naming it. Kind of like I think a lot of us have been in situations where, why do I have to kind of negotiate or build a bridge between people that, they should know better, that they can see a bigger picture, and that there's kind of a greater good, if only we could kind of reconcile some of the differences that are out there, and how to name that. And I think, because we're systems change leaders at different scales, we've kind of had to do that without necessarily being, that's not necessarily part of our job descriptions. It's kind of falling into the cracks, but it's so critical. And so, those are, we're going to relate some of the examples, in ways that we've been able to embody that without necessarily naming it. The second kind of phase is, well, inviting with an open heart and minds, and just really kind of reaching out to people that we felt, that we look up to, people that we've learned from, people that we know are already kind of, thinking about this, that posture and positionality that I'm naming. And, that's how we came about to kind of developing that definition and bring that up and just say, does that connect with you? And the reaction has been quite positive. In some cases, people have told us, like, thank you for like naming kind of something that I'm already doing, but that's not being made kind of visible or recognized in the work that I do. And as we did that, then we kind of formalize, but I don't want to be too kind of like rigid about the structure, because this isn't we're not, it's not a startup. We're not kind of looking at this as like a consultancy. We're really looking at this as like, does this connect and can this be helpful for, people that want to do good in the world? And so in doing so, we kind of named ourselves as co-stewards of this this conversation, which is, by design going to evolve and will require, different circles to have different kinds of conversations, as well as, kind of seeing how it can play out, concretely in different contexts. And so the third phase would be approaching an emerging field and practice. And so kind of holding different spaces and inviting people in and being challenged by, whichever kind of worldviews and perspectives kind of feed and support and even challenge systemic mediation as something that can be, helpful to many people. So that's where we find into phase 3, which is our kind of field sensing basis. And then let's see what happens. Hopefully there's going to be another kind of little arrow that jumps to like phase 4, and then we can see, if we can kind of connect with more context and communities in the work that we do at different scales with different types of kind of situations and whatnot. Not sure, Louise, if you wanted to add a little bit around that, because you came around more phase 2 than in the phase kind of 1, and so
yeah. I mean, I'll say more later. First of all, happy February 28th. It would have been the last day of Black History African Heritage Month, but this is a leap year, so we've been granted one more day. And just really honored to be here. And I would say that, yeah, the very structure of this work that we're doing is stewarding collective and collaborative. So deliberately, all the perspectives that we share are not static and are not intended to be the beginning of institutionalizing something. They really are open to exploration and exposition and challenging, and intentionally is why we've left enough space in this presentation for you all who are participating to I keep saying, add more spices to the soup. Yeah, we're not preparing the meal to share with people. We're saying we're all making this meal together. And if it's not soup, then definitely contribute your contributions is what I would say. So thanks.
Okay, so for the next maybe like 15, 20 minutes, we want to kind of share with you examples of how kind of we've how systemic mediation came about in our respective journeys for Louise and I. And I think it's important also just to name that, it's something that has happened over time. For myself, I think I could probably kind of relate it back to like almost 10, 15 years, where I kind of saw myself kind of emerge as an intermediary. And I had to kind of think, like, why do people trust me, to be in these situations where, I could be helpful, and what is required of me to do good, in these collaborative contexts. Of course, the world, has changed, and in many ways, the experiences that, I'll share with you are reflective of, the multiple crises that are kind of simultaneously kind of unfolding and becoming harder to kind of digest and understand and kind of wrap our heads around. And so the first example that I want to share with you is comes from, I guess I could call it the story of respect and humility. When I first kind of came back to Canada after having worked alongside human rights activists in many contexts, I found my place in the open data and civic tech community. I wasn't a civic tech entrepreneur. I didn't know how to code. My background was in philosophy and political organizing. And so I got involved and at the local level in Montreal and co-founded Open Montreal and Open Quebec. And this was kind of, it's kind of weird to think about it, how we thought differently about data and technology back then. But we're kind of looking at data and technology as, a bit of a belief that technology could make democracy better, and that if there was more data that was available, then, that was a good thing. And pre-Cambridge Analytica, pre a lot of the kind of controversies that we saw around data. And so with this kind of like, almost like techno-utopist kind of like kind of mindset, we were helping governments around Canada and internationally to build open data infrastructure and make data available. And then people weren't necessarily kind of showing up. And so that was a bit of a challenge for us, because we were helping government embark in this kind of digital transformation. And just that required us to develop more empathy to understand, how can we help government do that better? But once they did it, then, the data that was available, went like, well, what are we looking at here? And what does that data tell us? And the key kind of aspect of this kind of anecdote that I want to share with you is that utopic kind of like a bit of kind of positive kind of thinking around data and technology that was really at the heart of the open data movement came to be challenged by kind of Indigenous leaders in my case. And so it's when I connected with an Indigenous elder, Gwen Phillips, from the Kuniaksa Nation in BC. And she kind of saw that, I was gaining, just my position of kind of power and influence in the open data kind of community. And she kind of reached out and said, why don't you spend a little bit of time with me and other elders in Canada, and listen and build relationships and understand, that data is not a neutral thing, and that data comes from context, and data is actually something that can cause a lot of harm. And that really, kind of opened my mind. And it didn't stop there. And I think that was kind of like a shift that I had to kind of recognize. I could have just kind of continued, as a social kind of tech kind of entrepreneur, but I didn't. And so I kind of processed those learnings and brought those back to the open data community. And we learned a lot about Indigenous data sovereignty and principles of ownership and control and access and possession of data. And that was like a really, really big shift that required us to let go of some of our kind of power and influence and kind of recognize kind of the deeper kind of like conversation around the power dynamics related to data. And a lot of that, I would say personally and professionally, I can relate back to those conversations with Elder Phillips as well. So that's my first anecdote. The second one, and I was definitely not calling that as systemic mediation, but the second one I think kind of gradually kind of came about a little bit more visibly for me, and that's when I moved to Harlem, when I got the opportunity to get a Obama scholarship through the Obama Foundation, and got to spend a year in New York. So I moved to Harlem, didn't want to live on campus. I was like, okay, let's move to Harlem. And I think two weeks after I moved, there was a massive hurricane that hit. And several people, actually many people got, flooded. There was flash floods everywhere over Harlem. Big damages took place. And as a newly kind of new resident in Harlem, I wondered, like, how could it be that 7 blocks away at Columbia University, where I was studying for a year with the new kind of polished kind of climate school, where you have some of the top climate scientists who are writing those reports that have been predicting climate change, that climate knowledge or climate science wasn't, being made good use in communities that were most vulnerable or most likely to be affected by the types of impacts that they had been documenting and predicting. And so I spent a lot of my time actually at Columbia University when I was meeting professors and researchers and climate scientists, asking them like a single question. How do you know that the knowledge and expertise and the knowledge and data that you're collecting can actually translate into climate action and climate justice. And that really spurred me to, first of all, volunteer and connect with an environmental justice organization in Harlem called We Act for Environmental Justice, and organize and just be slowly, gradually better understand the context and connect with local residents and learn and understand like how are residents in Harlem mobilizing themselves, but then what is the connection that could be made with climate scientists, and what are the boundaries of climate knowledge or climate science, and what is that community wisdom that is helping build that readiness locally. And so I spent some of my time organizing workshops, and just leveraged the fact that I had this wonderful opportunity through the Obama Foundation, and used that to convene and organize workshops where I would bring or invite climate scientists, community organizers, representatives from the city, as well as elected officials. And then we would have an intersectoral conversation around how do we build that bridge between knowledge, action, and justice. And that positionality and posture, it wasn't about me. It was ultimately about, folks there living in Harlem, experiencing it, but I could see that those connections weren't being made. And it taught me a huge amount. And it made me question, like, what is that skill set? Because I don't necessarily have much to gain from that, but except for caring about other human beings and being a Harlem resident. And so that was that a bit of triangulation in the public interest, like nexus there, and that intermediary role that I think was emerging. So that to me was like, I think it's systemic mediation. And I connected with a professor in Harlem, at Columbia, that specialized in negotiation, and he started naming some of the skills and competencies. Last example, because I don't want to take too much time. Last example, more closer to home, in Montreal. So after Harlem, came back to Montreal, got connected to Concordia University, and through a relationship that I established with the Montreal Climate Partnership, which is the main entity that brings together philanthropy, private sector, and public institutions to track and monitor and implement some of the carbon neutrality objectives, the carbon action plan of the city. Reached out to the Montreal Climate Partnership, and I asked them, okay, so you've got a really important ecosystemic position in Montreal to bring people together to achieve these objectives. What is your what's the data around it? Like, what's the data strategy around it? Do we actually know what we're monitoring? How can we track this? So at first, face value, that sounds like a technology or a typical question, but it really isn't. It's really about developing collaboration relationships, that creates incentives for people to share data in a way that they're not already, so that we're able to have that collective intelligence to better understand, how we can share things that we hold preciously to ourselves around the data. And I'm talking about the private sector and even the public sector. And how do we facilitate that process of collaboration? And so through that acknowledgement, I've been formally, put into a posture where I act as an intermediary to set up the Montreal Climate Data Hub. And the Montreal Climate Data Hub is around the notion of data collaboratives. But the data collaboratives, there's the technical part to create that digital environment where data can be shared from multiple sectors. But at the end of the day, it's bringing utilities companies together. It's about climate finance. It's about different boroughs that don't necessarily talk to each other, and it's that positionality, and embodying and acting that systemic mediation lens that I think is like playing out. And it's probably the first time that I can say that it's been named as something that's part of my job description. And by design, what we're doing in Montreal, we want to document it in a way that we can share that experience and process so that it could be beneficial for the multiple communities around the country in Canada that are also kind of facing a bit of a intersectoral kind of collaboration deficit, if I can call it that. So I'll stop there. Those are kind of like three of my own kind of personal professional examples that I want to share with you today.
Thank you so much, Jean-Noé. A question that I'm hoping you'll answer just whenever we get to opening up for questions that I asked a lot is, what are social ecological systems? So I'm preparing you to answer that at some point. So hello, everyone, once again. My invitation and connection to this amazing series of explorations that I think those of us who are co-stewards are doing happened about initially kind of in May last year and then more formally in the fall. But it's a natural evolution for me when I think about the things I've been interested in and focused on and passionate about, just kind of my lifelong curiosity of how do you change the things you can't accept? Because there are things that you have to accept that will not change, and then there's things you have to accept are going to change whether you're involved or not. But what is the process by which systems can change? And for me, that is very much based on my positionality, having multiple intersecting identities that are in fact impacted by systems that don't change. And so when I was going through the process of thinking through why do I want to join this group, it was really because I hadn't yet seen a context to deliberately explore what does that mean for people. And I remember saying that in kind of my public announcement that I joined this group is we keep talking about being soft on people and hard on systems. However, it is people acting in systems that make those systems hard. Systems are not physical living beings. They are full of people that are enacting actions that are impacting other people, and also the more than human, which we thank you so much for drawing that into the conversation. And it's not surprise to me that while I may not have examples to the extent that Jean-Noé has, that almost all of Jean-Noé's examples are kind of in climate, because when you think about what is, you know, of the many crises over time, the one that is possibly an existential crisis is climate. However, even the way we are conceptualizing of that and not understanding the positionality in multiple intersecting identities in terms of who's going to be impacted and who gets to design the solutions is really something to consider. But to back up, so for me, when I joined, it wasn't because I have had many examples in which I have been a system mediator or mediated systems. It's been that I've been in many different contexts that I think would really benefit from mediation, because there has been a tendency for our archetypes to fall back into this, I know what we should do, so if we can just all agree with me, then we'll do the thing. And whether that's based on power and resources or other elements, the ways in which the change that we're looking for is stuck is something that I've been very curious about. And then I've also, I remember it might have been 2 years ago, was really kind of gently critical, so not challenging, but kind of calling in, and maybe now I've learned a new term called calling forward, the social innovation and systems change space of, you know, we've talked about incrementality and tiny experiments and prototyping, but some of the things that Jean-Noé have talked about, you can't really prototype certain relationships. You can't really prototype your way out of intergenerational harms and deep systemic incidences that have mass and collective and cascading effects of people. I've actually, one of the things that I wrote, because I want to focus particularly on housing and how that is manifesting for me in terms of something that needs systemic mediation, is, you know, in 2020, the world discovered that anti-Black racism exists. And, you know, I'm kind of being facetious because we knew all along, but there was a reckoning around it. And in 2021, there was probably another reckoning. And then we started talking about these multiple crises as a polycrisis. And where I would say, me personally, and maybe other people have said this, is where we are now in 2024 is we're not just in polycrises, we are also in poly-reckonings. because the movements and the reckonings and the impacts, we're starting to see that they're intersecting and that we can't actually continue to work on things in silos in the way that we have. And that's why, for me, the examples I want to focus on in terms of systems that mediation is housing. One very public to those of you who are on LinkedIn, somebody from New Brunswick was talking about the housing sector there and how the beginning of even being able to conceive of what is possible is difficult because there's no willingness among the players within just that sector alone, let alone if we are to get into multi-solving of bringing other sectors together. So I would say that's a place where systems mediation or systemic mediation has a role, and I actually suggested that to the individual. And then in Nova Scotia, a second example that I would use that, if I can find it, I'll put it in the chat, but as I'm talking, maybe somebody will find it. A public article that has been written around land development and generational municipal decisions around development as particularly impacting Africville residents and Africville descendants. So the original Africville settlement was essentially razed, there's no nicer way to put it, and a bridge was built across the harbor. And the residents there were displaced, some are around the city and some moved further afield. But there was quite a number that moved to a north end part of the city. And the descendants of Africville who were living there are now being displaced due to gentrification. And at the same time, there is the possibility of redeveloping, I think it's like about eight property block of developments. And so some of those displaced residents are asking the city, can you give us one of these pieces of land so that we can do something on it, so that we, maintain our sense of place. And the disheartening way in which that conversation is playing out, which I would just welcome everyone to Google instead of me elaborating on it, to me lends itself to systems mediation, because it is a pattern of municipal development that I think we can all agree is needed. However, it is impacting a very specific community of people, and it's now intergenerationally impacting that specific community of people. And each time these impacts are happening, the various generations of municipal players are making it possible or allowable or defensible because of commercial viability or economic development. And so at which point can we maybe have both? Can we have emplacement of peoples and no longer continuing this pattern of, Joanne, I just saw your note. I can post them all after I finish talking. There's a Halifax Examiner article specifically that will speak to this. And then there was a planner, Christine Hampton, who also wrote publicly about this. So for me, that's how I would see systems or systemic mediation coming alive, is really creating the spaces or bringing conversations to the forefront that acknowledge the needs and perhaps the competing and conflicting needs, and determining what is possible if we actually went further than that. And I think on that note, I participated in a course called Leading Complex Systems at Royal Roads in 2013, 2014, I don't remember the time frame. And of the many different topics that were taught, there was one around systems coaching. And for me, it was the most impactful of everything that we learned, because I had not until that point learned that, and this is going to contradict everything I just said. So welcome to systems mediation. I'm mediating myself in this conversation, that the system has its own intelligence, and that a systems coach, the language was coach, not mediator, taps into that intelligence to listen for what the system needs. And I'm very encouraged by that. I'm fascinated by cracks, and I'm fascinated by how much is cracking in the context of multiple crises, polycrises or polyreckonings. And I participated in a series by Bayo Akomolafe called We Will Dance with Mountains. And he was also very curious about cracks. What if we don't hold one side of the binary or another? And in the context of systems mediation, I'm curious about, is the role of the mediator to form the crack, or to notice that there are cracks, or to hold the crack open so that whatever needs to emerge from the crack can emerge from the crack? And so I'm really excited to be on this journey with this group. And I'm interested in what people who joined us feel about what we have to say. And so I'm going to turn it over back to whoever's next, and I'm going to go and interact in the chat. Thank you.
Louise, Jean-Noé, thank you so much, merci. And everyone adding all these amazing resources in chat, thank you as well. So let's go to that question. The question is really, can you relate to this? And if so, how so? Share what's coming up for you. We'll use chat for that, and we'll share screens here again so that you can see the question. But we really want to have as much of a conversation as we can about how you're experiencing this and what here resonates. To give you a minute to think about that question and start to put your responses in, I'll just share back some of what I'm taking from this conversation, and then look back to you, Jean-Noé and Louise, if you are then inspired to add anything on that you might want to share. So I want to say first that, maybe many of us have these experiences with mediation as something interpersonal, something between people or between small groups of people. And I just love the analogy that you've painted of the ways that we can relate to the idea of systems mediation at the local level or the regional level or national or even international level across any of these topics or outcomes that you've talked about, whether housing or climate or anything else. It is a new concept, and yet there is something so relatable about it because so many of us have this experience of mediation on a very interpersonal level. I want to thank you too for bringing this back into this long tradition of systems change. If anyone has not read the initial blog that Pastuszek and Jean-Noé and Stefan and Lara and Louise put together, it's such a comprehensive history of different approaches to systems change. And I really recommend looking at that to understand more about what they were saying about long traditions. I really appreciated everything you said about naming. Definitions are not easy. They are positional. They do change over time. And the work of defining terms together can be so powerful in terms of seeing where there's divergence and then where groups have some convergence as well. I really appreciate about this approach how much it's focused on ongoing learning and ongoing reflection. Who knows sort of at what point in the journey you're in, and you said that, but you're at a point right now where you've taken some steps, you've had some conversations, you've built some relationships, you've done sense making back to previous experiences you've had, and it's so apparent that you're already in this process of assessing what that means and learning from it and finding meaning of it. So I think there's a lot to learn from that stance you're taking, hopefully for your work, but also for all of us who are so committed to evolution and transformation and learning together in order to be able to evolve into something new. And then the last thing I'll offer is just that I'm holding some of these questions that you've asked. Jean-Noé, you talked about the question of, why do people trust me? How can I build trustworthiness? You talked about the idea of what is required of me to do good in this moment, in this context, given the inequity I'm trying to address. Louise, you talked about the question of how can I change the things that I cannot accept? You ask that often, and it's a really powerful and important question. And then the way that a few minutes later, you ask the question of who gets to design the experiments that might produce that change. The pairing of those two questions is really powerful to me because it helps me think about, given the positionality, the privileges, the intersecting identities that we each hold, given what those identities look like across the group, what is the change that we cannot accept, and what must we each do? What must we leave to others because it's not our work to do. So let me pause there, and as we're starting to see some examples come in, just see if either one of you wants to add anything into the conversation at this point. And Jean-Noé, I know we wanted a definition from you, so if you want to go there, that's one option.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the it's not easy to kind of, and I wouldn't see it as like a synthesis or a summary. It's more kind of a, what I'm hearing from you, Danya, is like a self-reflective, like what you picked up from it, right? Because you're not necessarily claiming kind of authority around like, what matters most. What I'm hearing from you is that kind of that your humanity and how the concept connects with you and what you're hearing and listening. And I think these are the skills that we're like talking about. And if we can do that better, that would be great. But because we're facing these polycrises, and because the world is moving so fast, and these crises are deepening and exacerbating themselves, it's like we need to take more time to have these types of conversations because the world is moving faster and these problems and challenges are getting harder to resolve. So it's almost like counterintuitive when we look at these two different kind of temporal, like time scales. Let's look more deeply to learn new things about ourselves in order to be able to look forward and backwards and recognize, where these kind of value systems and interests and these things that are getting us stuck kind of like come from. So I just want to like name that, because I think what I'm also hearing and I'm always learning from Louise whenever you're kind of sharing your experiences, and also kind of, like we didn't know each other kind of very well before, and just kind of expressing gratitude around like the ability of kind of holding spaces like these together, because I think that's part of the kind of inner work and the kind of humility that I've kind of come to really kind of name, so that I can have a better or a more open heart and a more open mind. So I just want to kind of like say that. And because what I'm also hearing from our examples and Danya's, your observations, is how do we establish kind of a better readiness for these complex collaborations? We've been called into these meetings where it's like, okay, a funder has decided to, allocate more funding towards, this program, and these objectives are there. And then we're maybe a nonprofit or a local stakeholder. And then we get called into a meeting, and then we're kind of told, we're going to consult you, but within these parameters. But the parameters is where, these systems are manifested and kind of express themselves, but we don't necessarily get to challenge them. So, the ways that we're kind of thinking about this and how it's connecting with leaders and when I say leaders, I don't mean necessarily people in positions of power. I think we all have that kind of leadership within ourselves, because these problems are impacting us. Is how do we better align? How do we better kind of integrate? How do we better kind of see ourselves, through this work? So making those cracks more visible. So yeah, I mean, I think, in the social ecological kind of question, to me, honestly, it's a term that I learned when I came back to Montreal and Quebec, because I was involved in environmental justice in Harlem, but in Quebec they were talking about the socio-ecological transition. So to me, that was like, whoa, okay, like what is this all about? So I had to learn what the socio-ecological transition, but I think it's about these big transformational like shifts that we see, in society, and kind of like, and do we want to kind of, are we satisfied with transitions, or do we want to kind of push further in this more kind of transformative kind of like change that's required? I think sometimes like transition, and it's the transition, the Transition Bridges project. So maybe we need to think even more deeply around like transformations, because that's part of what I'm learning as I'm embodying this work as well.
I'm going to give Danya a chance to skim through the chat to feed us. Thank you so much, by the way, everyone who's engaging. I don't know if there's an ability for people to come off mute, but it'd be also nice to hear the voices of others that aren't ours. But I don't want to fracture the structure of the container that we've been given to have this conversation. So thank you for the people that have been engaging in the chat. One of the things that I saw that was asked that I want to respond to is around commenting on the dimensions of this versus labs versus convening versus etc. And this is my poor paraphrase of what was asked. And then I want to, there was somebody that asked about mediation and neutrality, and you're flagging that maybe transition is not the right name for our collective. So I may answer all of those together. So I'm positioning for you all what is rolling around in my head as I speak. One is we've really been intentional, and then also mediating ourselves in understanding that this is a journey, and it is moving, and it is living, and if we're truly doing something different, which is open and evolving, then we need to model that. And so I talked about being invited in May and being kind of on board in November, and the white paper that we will share a link to that was produced, the other co-stewards were actually super open to evolving the white paper based on my feedback. And our language is going to also evolve. And so we may collectively, not just Jean-Noé and I and the other for co-stewards, but based on the input that you're giving is like maybe mediation is not the word, maybe it's a different word. But as I answered in the Q&A to the individual that asked the question, I actually don't buy anymore neutrality and objectivity. Like I'm less interested in changing the terms and more curious about how we systemically mediate ourselves out of these problematic stances that aren't, I don't, just because of how I've been impacted by neutral and objective systems that aren't actually neutral and objective. It would be less so about changing system mediation than inviting the people that think that mediation is neutral to consider whether that's actually true. In terms of kind of the dimensions of labs, convenings, or any of the other infrastructure that we've talked about, I don't know if in the white paper we talked about labs specifically, but the way that I would answer the question of how transition or transformation project or the system mediation is we're saying that there is this role that is not visible, that is, we've been in conversations as co-stewards where some are acknowledged that it's actually not always, the assumption that it is played by somebody with our natural definitions of power is also flawed. It is kind of an emotional labor intensive, usually played by the person who's noticing the cracks and the patterns, who that then is dependent on your positionality and intersectional identity, not usually funded or paid for, and maybe unacknowledged because it happens kind of quietly and invisibly and in the dark. And so I would say that the attention we've paid to saying that it is, I think Jean-Noé said it several times in this, that it's different scales at different positions in the system, et cetera, is that you very well could have system mediation going on inside a lab. You just, until it's named as such, you don't know that that's what's going on. You may very well have system mediation happening, in, particularly if it's a consecutive series of convenings and not just a flash in the pan 1 hour or two-day workshop. You probably there is system mediation going on. It's just not named as such. So the intention of this work and the intention of this positionality, certainly from the co-stewards, is we're not wanting to introduce another framework, another methodology, another structure to build institutionalization around. We're actually much more curious about how we change the things we can't accept. And or, which is why I think Cracks has really resonated with everyone, how we hold space for these future literacies or future prototypes of future ways of that we need to be as humans and non-humans for mutually assured thriving. Because certainly in my experience, in my observation, what is true is there is not a stewards of or holders of space for these alternative ways of living and being and doing to emerge and to be supported enough to become stable enough so that we can shift into them. And the way we've currently been doing pretty much everything in our lives is just not sustainable. So if I, with the time left, and I'm going to stop talking and pass it back to Danya, is if I had to talk about why I'm particularly interested in this journey, is I can't change that crises are happening. I can't, and I'm excited for the poly reckonings. I can't necessarily change the suffering that is already happening and the suffering that is to come, but I want to be part of holding what is possible open for alternatives to continuing a pattern that is harming us and harming our world.
Amazing. Okay. I'm going to try to uplift some of what's happened in chat because unfortunately we don't, I learned, have the ability on this Zoom call to have people put voice to their ideas. So I want to thank everyone who's put ideas in chat, Betna, Njaki, Brooke, Benny, Julie, many others as well. I'm going to kind of summarize some of what's there and then ask you, Louise and Jean-Noé, if you could respond to one more question before we begin to say goodbye to one another here. Betna is making some really insightful comments around the divisiveness in communities and the amount of stigma that exists because we don't know one another oftentimes, and the us versus them mentality. And Jackie's offering several things, but something that's really sticking with me is the idea that accountability tools are becoming very blunt. And Jackie says that we need emergent strategies for accountability. We need to be emergent in how we hold each other in our responsibility and in our accountability. We need shared accountability to one another and to the process. Brooke is pointing out that she has a curiosity about the role of not just, you talked about the role of forming and noticing and holding open cracks, but Brooke is also offering that there might be a role around creating cracks, around surfacing and creating them, which I think is really powerful. Benny's noting that neutrality is the tool of colonial systems. Anais has offered a couple of definitions of systems mediation. And Julie is asking some good questions around many things, but one of them is really around branding and messaging. And so as I think about all of that, I think the question I'd invite you to think out loud with us on as we leave this conversation is, given how you've evolved over the course of the last hour in the words that you're using to describe this work, given everything you've said about definitions as complex and as evolving, and given what you've learned from the group, how would you define, or how are you holding the idea of this work right now?
I mean, I think for me, the fact that there are multiple questions and there are, it's kind of stimulating this type of like dialogue and exchange, which I won't attempt to try to answer all the questions that I'm seeing right now, but it does kind of, and I don't even want to say like validate. I think it's like, it sounds like it's resonating. And if it is, then let's go deeper. That's what I'm getting from this, is that I feel like hopeful in a way that there's a space that's being held right now, and that concept, however imperfect it might be, is connecting with people's positionality and postures and the type of initiatives that they're doing locally, and naming that it's really difficult. And we can't take that for granted. And I don't think anybody has illusions around that. And if they do, then maybe we need to kind of listen to each other even better and more deeply. And so I take, I'm looking at the questions, and I know that we have other co-stewards that are probably listening in as well. And I know that this is going to be kind of, we want to be able to kind of reflect back, through and with Tamarack, to be able to kind of build on this conversation and go even further. And there is one kind of thing I just want to kind of point to, is the notion of having to take off the Band-Aid sometimes. And that sometimes there needs to be a rupture with things that are broken and that have caused harm over generations. And I think that's also something that we're acknowledging as co-stewards. I think it has been today. And as we break from the past, there's also something to be said about auspicing, some of those systems. Some systems we need to break. There's also human beings that aren't necessarily, that didn't necessarily want to cause harm. And so there's a certain notion of like human dignity that's part of, these kinds of like transformative changes that we're talking about here. But I'm very grateful for the dialogue here.
Louise, how about you? How are you holding this idea as we leave our time here today?
I am furiously responding in the chat. How I'm holding the idea is I'm really, really looking forward. From the engagement, it looks like there are people who this is resonating with, and we're thankful for that. And then we also want to hear from people who this is not resonating with, because this is about the tough conversations, and this is about moving forward, whether together or not. And I regret that we didn't get to talk about inner work, but how I'm leaving here is really full to be able to share more widely. I mean, at some point there was 85 people on, and I think 110 people registered. And so it's been really, I feel very full and hopeful for having this much engagement and interest in talking about how we navigate polycrises and now also polyreckonings.
Louise, how can colleagues on this phone call others that will listen in later after the fact, get in touch with you all if they do want to learn more, ask more questions, continue the conversation?
We have a slide that we can pull up, but we can also put links in the chat. We have a website that people can subscribe to. Also, you can reach out to myself. I'll pass it on to Jean-Noé if he has an answer as well. We recognize that of the 6 stewards, we have different networks and different channels. And so we invite those of you who have a resonance with each of us to connect with each of us, as in how you know us, is my answer. Thanks.
Yes, I mean, I think just as we wrap up, I think we are looking for ways to kind of continue this conversation. Through the partnership that the Transition Bridges Project co-stewards team has with Tamarack. We are looking for, 2, 3, communities that are part of Tamarack's network to kind of continue this dialogue and see where it takes us. Whether it's something that, is kind of, within a given kind of collaborative that you're, setting up, maybe relationships, that, need, or could benefit from systemic mediation. I think we want to be able to learn as we're doing it in a way that is very, very mindful of how we need to respect and understand context. And that's not something that any of us would, presume that we know. And so we're looking for, collaborators that are anchored in these contexts, that are seeking ways to kind of deepen their work, through and potentially explore how systemic mediation relates to them. So please get in touch maybe with Tamarack. I think that's probably the best way to do that. And then we'll get back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that invitation. And just as we close here, Stephanie, Jaime, everyone else working behind the scenes, thank you so much for animating this space and bringing us all together. Louise and others who are supporting the translation of this into French. Merci. All of you who have accommodated me over the last hour to speak in my first language, English, thank you to you. Louise, Jean-Noé, thank you so much for being here. And mostly to all of you who are here or who will listen in later, who work in communities to diagnose the really complex problems and to make progress on them, and to stay in that work day after day over the years and years that it will take to get to the transformation, not just the transitions, but the transformations that Jean-Noé and Louise have helped us to believe and know are possible. From the depths of our hearts, thank you for all that you do. We are here in deep support of you and are grateful for what you do and for taking time today to be here to share your learnings and your journeys. With that, we will send a recording and all the resources that have been in the chat that you've all shared. Thank you, and take care of yourselves today.